I'm here today with Mike Robins, a well-known motivational speaker and emotional intelligence expert. He's also a former pro baseball player, an author, and a whole lot more. When I met Mike, I was on his podcast and really enjoyed our conversation about compassion. And it seemed we have a lot of shared passion for this topic. And he's got a new book out that I'm so excited to learn a lot about. So, Mike, I appreciate you accepting my invitation to have a conversation about compassion and leadership in today's really challenging times. And instead of doing a big introduction, I'd just love if you'd share a little bit about yourself and your background. And welcome to this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to connect with you and everybody who's listening and watching to our discussion. First of all, I appreciate you and your work and the influence it's had on me, as well as being able to quote you in my new book. We're all in this together. And, Nate, I've been doing this work for the last 20 years, working with teams and leaders and organizations, really focusing on authenticity and appreciation and compassion and how we infuse those things into the culture. But my interest in this work kind of came in sort of a unique way. I was an athlete. I was a pro baseball player, as you mentioned. I grew up in California in the Bay Area, where I still live, and played baseball as a kid. I was pretty good at it. I actually got drafted out of high school by the New York Yankees. I didn't end up signing with the Yankees at that time because I got an opportunity to play baseball in college at Stanford. So I went to Stanford, played there. Then I got drafted by the Kansas City Royals. And signed with the Royals.
Yeah, that's my Royals.
Your team, I know. Unfortunately, I never made it to Kansas City because, when you sign with a major league team like the Royals or the Yankees or any of the teams, you got to go in the minor leagues
right,
and work your way up. I was a pitcher and I got injured my third season still in the minors. So before I ever made it to the major leagues, I was injured. I had a series of surgeries on my pitching arm, wasn't able to make it back, which was super disappointing and devastating for me.
Oh.
But it actually ended up teaching me a lot about myself, about resilience, about change, about dealing with difficulty and challenge, which I'm finding useful in this time. But also what I became really fascinated by, Nate, though, in addition to loving the game itself, when I got to college and then when I was playing professionally, I became really keenly aware of the impact that team dynamics had on the success of a team. Even in something like sports, where you figure if you have the best athletes, you should have the best team. That was not always the case. Like the coach and how he sort of handled his staff, and ultimately how he dealt with us as the players, how we got along with each other or didn't, how we supported each other or didn't, the way we sort of dealt with our egos, all of these things that seemed sort of intangible and kind of like soft and squishy ended up having a huge impact on the success of the team and my own success as an individual. And I erroneously thought that was a sports thing. Then I got my first job in the late 90s in the .com, internet tech world. And I realized right away, oh, that whole team chemistry thing is not just a sports thing, it's a human thing. So after a couple of years working in the tech world, I started my consulting business 20 years ago, really wanting to find out what do teams and leaders and organizations need to do to really create that kind of culture. And so that's what I've been studying and writing about and speaking about for all these years.
Well, if it's just amazing that the teams you've worked with, the companies you've worked with, and realizing that this universal principle about team dynamics. And this COVID pandemic has really brought into the foreground the importance of compassion, which is kind of what connects us. And there's been this phrase going around. Everybody is using this. It's like we're in this together, and everyone is saying it. They're not like using it as the anthem of COVID. And my guess is at the basic level, what they mean is, well, you're suffering, we're suffering, everybody's afraid of COVID, whatever. But it seems to me that compassion, that's what compassion is we're actually in this together. And I'm curious, I want to get to your book that has us that plays off this, but what is your perspective on this notion?
Well, I wrote this book, which is my fifth, and I wrote it last year, even though I knew it was going to come out this spring, and used the title, We're All in This Together. Of course, not knowing that was going to then be this anthem, this rallying cry that we're hearing from, politicians to people in the media to CEOs. And, my take really, though, is, not specifically when we're going through a crisis or a pandemic like this, but I think in general, Nate, you know this because you've been studying this and teaching this for so many years. Like, there's so much that we have in common as human beings, even in our differences, right? Like you and I are different, even though we may look similar and say same gender,
Yeah,
same
yeah,
race. But like your life, my life, very different. We come from different families. We have different upbringings. We have different experiences. We have different personalities. But the more we get to know each other, even just in the little time we've got to know each other over the last year, it's like we start to realize like, oh, you have that experience or you feel that emotionally. Yes, so
yeah,
do I. And it's like, wow, human suffering, human desire, human, just the human experience.
yeah,
There's so much that we share in that. And then we live in this world where it's like, well, you live there and I live here and you're on this team and I'm on that team and you do this for a living and I do that and you went to that school and you're this race and all of those things are real and true. But yet at the same time, what binds us together as human beings is our shared human experience.
mm,
And in the team setting, all my years as an athlete and working with some great teams inside of some really great organizations over the last couple decades, whenever I'm around an extraordinary team, they figure out a way to get beyond the differences, the egos, the individual
yep,
ambitions to sort of buy into something that's bigger than just me and what I want. And as corny as that sounds, it involves compassion and empathy, but it also involves a certain amount of trust and faith in each other
yeah,
that when we bind together, and I think we know this intuitively, this is why I think we're using this phrase right now, we're all in this together, because when something really big happens like this and we all understand, we've never been through this before, we don't know exactly how we're going to get through it. We know intuitively we have to lean on each other
yeah,
because we're not going to be able to just figure this out on our own.
yeah. Well, my goodness, the timeliness. And I want to hear about some of the main themes in your book. And first, the title, We're All in This Together, Creating a Team Culture of High Performance, Trust, and Belonging. Like, what, how did it come to be that you picked this title and a year ago or whatever, and like it couldn't be more perfect? Everybody is chanting the title of your book. So
Yeah.
how timely is this message? What's the story there?
Well, it's kind of interesting because so I wrote my fourth book came out in 2018. It's called Bring Your Whole Self to Work. And I've been doing this work for 20 years. I had written 4 books up to that point. I mean, I love the work, Nate, but I don't love to write. And I really don't love to write books, to be honest. And I'm more of a speaker. I'm more of a talker than a writer, and I'm more extroverted than introverted. So to sit in a room in front of a computer and try to come up with thoughts, especially a big, 50, 60,000 word book that takes months and months and all that. Anyway, it's not my favorite thing. And usually when I'm done with a book, I'm like, I'm good for a few years. I don't need to do that again. And my family would agree. They're like, okay,
Yeah.
you're good. But like 3 weeks after Bring Your Whole Self to Work came out, I had this download. And it really was like a mental, emotional download that I got. You're going to write another book. It's going to sort of pick up where you left off with Bring Your Whole Self to Work. And it's going to be called We're All in This Together. And if you'd seen me walking down the street having this conversation, you'd have thought I was a crazy person because I was like looking up at the sky going, no, thank you. Please go bug somebody else with this idea. Like, I'm not doing that. But after a few days, I sat down and the idea just kind of came out and I put it together in a proposal. I sent it to all the people, my agent, editor and publisher. They were all interested, but none of them liked the title.
So you already had the title, We're in This Together. That was your idea.
It was really clear. And the funny thing is, I've been starting to use this phrase over the last couple of years, just in social media posts, usually when I was commenting on how divided we are as a country and a world. Like I would just say, look, I get that we have differences. I get we disagree. I think it's important to have debates, but come on, like we're all in this country together. We're all in this world together. And the program, the speech and the workshop that I've been leading for almost 20 years on teamwork is called The Keys to Creating a Championship Team, which kind of plays on my sports background. And so my agent and my editor and the publisher all said, we like the book, we like the idea, but let's call it The Keys to Creating a Championship Team. And I said, no, that's not the title. And in fact, if we don't call it We're All in This Together, I'm not writing it. I'll do it later. I was adamant about it. I was like, because I was like, that feels like a really important message right now with all the divisiveness in the country and the world.
Yeah.
And the book is really about finding common ground and coming together. And finally, they all said, okay, fine. And they sort of acquiesced to me and let me have the title, even though they didn't really want it. And then here we are. And again, I didn't do it. I told you so to them because it wasn't like that. But I was like, I guess there was some other deeper intuitive knowing that I had that this was going to be really important.
So do you know John Gordon, the Energy Bus, and a
I
lot of
do.
those?
John and I are good friends. In fact, I was just on his podcast.
So I got to tell you a story really quick about titles. So my last book, Conflict Without Casualties, I didn't have a title and I couldn't come up with a title. The book was done. That was the only thing missing. And I could not come up with a title. And I
Wow.
called John. I was like, John, would you give me 10 minutes? I just know that talking to you somehow is going to help.
He's
And he
good
gave
like
me, he's good. He gave me some time and we talked a little bit. And he said, the last thing he said, you know, Nate, if God put the book on your heart, he'll put the title on your heart. You just have to be open. And
that.
I'm like, okay, I trust you. We kind of ended it. 3 days later, I'm driving to Wichita, Kansas. I come around in the morning, I come around this on ramp and I'm driving into the sun and I can hardly see. And all of a sudden I realize I'm going up onto a battlefield and the sun is shining and nobody's going to get hurt. And it
Mm,
was like conflict without casualties. And it
wow.
was like, I got the download, but yours
That's
yours
cool.
came at the beginning, but I guess we can both thank John Gordon for being just a great inspiration.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and
Yeah,
I think the thing about, I mean, I would say this with respect to both compassion, but also even inspiration and creativity, as we're talking about. I mean, I really do think it's about opening our minds and opening our hearts and
yeah,
listening.
yeah,
And that's so much, this, right? It's like, what's compassion really about with respect to other people, but also within ourselves? It's really opening up, it's listening, it's going beneath the surface, beneath the story, and really connecting with who's over there,
yeah,
what's
yeah,
going on. And I think, for me, I remember hearing Jeff Weiner, the CEO of
yeah.
LinkedIn. He and I both spoke at an event called Wisdom 2.0 a number of years ago, and he was up on stage and I was sitting backstage before it was my turn to speak. And it was like a sort of fireside chat with him and Soren, who's the creator of this big annual conference. And Soren said, "What's the most important element of leadership?" And without hesitation, Jeff said, "Compassion." And it was like, this was like 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm sitting backstage going,
Yeah,
"What did he say? Did he
yeah,
really say that?" Like, and I didn't know Jeff. And that was the only time I ever met him. And I had a lot of respect for him as a leader and for what he'd done in turning LinkedIn around and really being a great, leader and CEO, at least from what I'd read and heard about from afar. But I was like, wow. And they've made a commitment at LinkedIn, as I'm sure you know, that
oh,
compassion is one of their core values and principles. And in fact, my friend Scott Shute, who works there, is the head of mindfulness and compassion programs
yeah,
at LinkedIn. And part of how that even came to be was Scott, who ran a big organization within the company of about 1,000 people, was the executive sponsor of their mindfulness program. You probably know
yeah,
this and probably know Scott.
yeah,
But he basically came to Jeff and said, "Hey, we talk about compassion." Jeff gave this big speech at Wharton, commencement speech a couple years ago, and he talked all about compassionate leadership. And basically, like, all this media wanted to talk to Jeff afterwards about, well, what does that actually mean, or
yeah.
how do
What do
we
you
do that?
do?
What does that look like? And there's people
Yeah,
like you, Nate, and out in the world who are out teaching this. And to me, it seems like compassion is the next frontier of leadership competency that I really think is going to continue to grow and expand, because we're learning, and
yeah,
especially through COVID, how important and essential it is.
man, so true. And I was going to ask you to share a little bit about the main pillars of your book, but I think I want to wait for the podcast.
Okay.
For our listeners here, I am going to interview you about your book. I really want to hear about the book, about the main points and everything. And but there is a theme in your book about psychological safety,
Yes.
and I'm curious. That's a big buzzword these days. What's your view? What is this about?
Well, basically, it's actually the first of the four pillars is create psychological safety. And psychological safety, the way I like to think of it, it's kind of like it's like emotional intelligence, right? It sounds very fancy and important, and it is. But what it really means, I always like to break these things down. So what does that actually mean? To me, psychological safety basically means group trust. You create a team that's safe enough for what? For if you and I are on the same team, Nate, and we can disagree with each other, or I know the team is safe enough that I can, have a dissenting opinion or talk about something sensitive or take a risk and make a mistake or have a crazy idea and try
Yeah,
something, even if I fail, knowing that I'm not going to get shamed, I'm not going to get ridiculed, I'm not going to get kicked out of the group. I can come
right.
to the group and say, I'm struggling with this, or I'm scared about this, or I could use some help. And it's not going to somehow diminish me. Then the team has psychological safety. And what we know from research, and what started to really put this into the forefront over the last few years of people talking about it more, the work of Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, she's been doing research on this for the last couple decades. But her work, along with a 3-year research project that took place at Google they called Project Aristotle. And then the findings came back of that. And that study was basically done by Google trying to solve the problem of what's necessary for teams to create high performance. What do they need to do and have culturally? And what came back from that study was the number one, by far, most important element of success for teams culturally was psychological safety. And so a lot of people like me started saying, well, what is that? And we started to get curious about it. And now we're all talking about it. But the fundamental elements of how we create more psychological safety have to do with compassion, have to do with empathy, and have to do with vulnerability. And when leaders and teams operate with those things, they create more of that psychological safety, which then allows the team to thrive.
That's the word vulnerability. You said it. That's the word that makes leaders go running for the hills. And here's an interesting a dilemma. And we're going to hear train in the background here, but that's all right. Here's a dynamic we see. So when we're working with teams, particularly when the leader is there with the team, and we might talk about vulnerability, we talk about these things. And I might say, for example, to the employees or to the, the reports, I might say, so if your boss came clean with you and got vulnerable about maybe something they're struggling with or something they didn't have figured out, or maybe they were worried about how you saw them and asked for help from you, how would that affect your view of them? And without exception, they're like, oh, that would be awesome. I would love to know that because we're in this together. That's what they say.
Right?
Then I ask the boss, so could you see yourself doing that? And the boss is like, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. That would be weak.
Right. Well, you're right. And look, I think this is the conundrum both leaders, but all of us as human beings face, because here's the funny part of this. And I've heard, Brene Brown talk about this, who obviously is an expert in vulnerability and been studying it, but I know this to be true from my own experience. When other people are vulnerable with us, so Nate, if you're vulnerable with me, 99 times out of 100, my reaction to that is going to be, wow, that was courageous. You shared something. I'm struggling with this, or I screwed this up, or I need some help with this, or whatever, right? It's like, wow, thank you, Nate, for trusting me enough to say that. That shows a lot of courage on your part. And I'm not only admiring the courage, but I appreciate it because I feel more connected to you.
Yeah.
When I'm being vulnerable, sadly, 99 times out of 100, the way I relate to it, or most of us as human beings relate to it, is, oh my gosh, I'm being weak. So vulnerability feels like weakness over here, but it looks like courage over there. So part of the leap of faith that we have to take as human beings and ultimately as leaders is to remember, yes, this is going to probably feel awkward and uncomfortable. The voice in my head is going to be yelling at me, don't say this, don't do this. Something bad's going to happen. You're going to look bad or look weak. And look, it is a risk. So there is a chance in life someone might judge us as weak. Someone might use it against us. That's what requires the courage. That's why vulnerability requires courage. And so if we're courageous enough to be vulnerable, what we do, and especially for leaders to do this, you set the tone. I mean, I can't tell you how many leaders I've worked with that say, I want people to let me know when they're struggling or when they need help or when they disagree. And then I say to them, okay, how often do you do that? Do you let people know when you're struggling? Do you ask for help?
Yeah.
You let people know when you disagree, or when people disagree with you, are you grateful for the disagreement, or do you get defensive? It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to actually practice it and make it safe for people to do it.
So we talk about safe honesty compared to real honesty. And it's really interesting. Some people will say, can I be honest with you? Or, permission to speak candidly. And it's like, oh, we're going to get all honest. And then what they do is they say something about me. Like, your zipper's down, or, that was really awkward what you did over there. And it's like, wait, so you're being honest, but it's really safe because after you say what you say, I'm more vulnerable. And so we've kind of started talking about safe honesty, which is the kind where I tell the truth about you. But real honesty is where I tell the truth about me. I'm struggling. And I think that's what you're talking about is I got to show my cards emotionally if I really want to take the first step to do the courageous thing.
Right, because in that example, I mean, look, if your zipper's down or something happened that's sort of more factual, it's me commenting on that, and that can be a little awkward. But if I come to you with a honest judgment of you, well, Nate, I think you talk too much, man, or whatever, right? Even if there's some validity to it, you go, I know, Mike, I do. You're right. What I'm doing now is I'm self-righteously judging you and putting myself in a position above you, and you might, right? Yeah. But if I come and say, look, I'm having a hard time. um, getting a word in, and I don't know, like I don't want to step on
Yeah.
your toes, but
Yeah.
it's like I'm struggling with that.
Yeah.
That's the same basic feedback. That like basically my judgment is there's a lot of talking coming from you. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I take the response of I'm gonna own that I'm struggling with this because that's true and that's real and that's
Right.
vulnerable.
Right.
I want to figure out how to engage more effectively, and I don't know how to do that yet.
Yeah.
Can we have a conversation about it? And if I do it that way, most likely you're going to be less defensive and more open to that discussion than if I come in, either say nothing and I'm just passive aggressive about it,
Yeah.
or I come in and say, let me tell you honestly what I think, man. You need to stop talking so much so I can talk. And it's
Dude,
like, whoa,
I'm just telling it like it is.
right, I'm just being real, man. You got to, and then now we're having a debate about
Right.
who's right,
Right.
as opposed to having what you like a real
Yeah.
conversation about where we're actually coming from.
Yeah. Well, I am super excited to talk about your book, and kind of to bring this. We could just go on and kind of to bring this plane down to land here. I'm curious if you'd be willing to try something with me. And
Yep.
I did not warn you about this or anything, but in the spirit of just being honest, say real honesty and vulnerability. Both of us are entrepreneurs. We are trying to make a go out of this COVID thing, and the slog is getting long here. And I've been talking to a lot of leaders that are kind of like, they start to show those cracks. And when you start to get behind there and let the light shine in, it's like, this is hard stuff. And I'm curious, what say we end with each of us sharing just something about how we're doing?
Hmm.
How are we really doing with this?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. Absolutely, man. I love
Yeah.
this. We call this in our work, lowering the waterline on the iceberg, right? It's like getting real with the real
Yeah.
honesty. I mean, I
Yeah.
would say, um, it's been hard. It's been scary. For me, we've had to, readjust everything we do basically. Um, and I feel like I've been saying this recently. It's a weird analogy,
Mm.
but it makes sense with my background. It's like I feel like I'm still playing baseball. In fact, I'm still pitching, but I'm forced to pitch with the other hand. And it's not very strong. And I feel really uncomfortable and awkward. And it's like, I've been doing this for a long time. I really know what I'm doing, but how come I feel like a beginner at the same time? And, if you really knew me, you would know I, I love the work, but the
Yeah.
fear of all that I've built and everything that I've spent all these years developing just kind of going away has
Yeah.
been driving me more than I really even think
Yeah.
I've been fully acknowledging.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for taking the first step. For me, the thing I've really been struggling with is I put so much pressure on myself to have a plan for my team, that I'm supposed to, as the CEO, I'm supposed to have a plan that they can feel confident, and so they don't have to feel afraid. That's my job. And the other thing I'm realizing, kind of with that left right arm thing, is that this whole notion of what got you here won't get you there. I'm really facing it. The kinds of, how do I motivate and connect with someone remotely when I'm used to doing it personally? And this is not just temporary anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm really finding my skill sets being super stretched and wondering, what is it going to look like? So
Yeah.
yeah, that's where I'm at. And
Yeah.
um, I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the book. And Mike, I appreciate you coming back again. For those of you that don't know this, we did this, we tried this and the recording didn't work. And so Mike was so gracious to come back, give me some more of your time to do this. And I just love getting to know you and looking forward to interviewing for my podcast on compassion about your book. We're all in this together, and anyone can go get it now if they want
Yeah.
to.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's great to do it even the second time. And look, man, we're all learning. I learned some stuff about Zoom and we figured it out together.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's actually beneficial to me. And it's fun to connect with you again and with everybody who's listening and watching.
All right. Take care.